How's it going, everybody? My name is Omar Chauhan,
I'm Becca.
and we are both licensed social workers. Well, I'm still waiting for my license.
I got my license.
But anyways, we're both trauma-informed social workers, and we thought we'd get together and put together a cool little podcast about trauma, what it is. What else do we have in the title?
I think that's mostly what we're going to talk about today is because there's so much with trauma that it took us 2 years.
Yeah.
So today I think we're just going to start talking a little bit about trauma and what it is. Keep it pretty simple for this first one because we can dive into so many parts.
Absolutely.
So, and just like keep in mind that this is just one theory too for this.
100%.
There are lots of other theories that we could apply to this, but we're just going to use this lens for today.
Yeah. We had the privilege, and we were fortunate enough to have our professor be a specialist in trauma-informed care. So we learned as much as we could within a span of 2 years, but this isn't the end-all, be-all. Do your own research. And most importantly, this is not medical advice. We are not your therapist. If you need psychiatric or mental health services, please go ahead and call your provider. If you don't have one, see if you can find one. I wish you the best.
Call 988 if you are in
yes,
trouble.
Absolutely. Yes, that too. So what we got first?
Okay. Well, I think our first thing to hit is kind of what trauma is.
Yeah. So, do you want to go first or?
You go ahead.
So the way I understand it in the most layman's terms, trauma or a traumatic response rather is a physiological response to an external stimuli that is posing a threat to you. More specifically, the lower part of your brain, which I like to call the lizard brain. It includes your brainstem and your amygdala. Long story short, there are components in this part of your brain that when it's exposed to a threat, it triggers a fight or flight response. Now, whether or not you develop PTSD from the traumatic event or not, all depends on your resiliency factors. And by that, I mean your environment and how validating it was in allowing you to process your trauma. Or if you don't have the opportunity to process that, then it could develop into PTSD. But that's my take.
Yeah, I think that the definition of trauma itself kind of gets a little muddied. I think that that happens with the DSM because the criteria is a little it's dicey.
Yes, yeah, and that's why we're bringing this today because there's so much gray area and just such a shady history, in my opinion. That's my cat. Such a shady history in how PTSD as a diagnosis even came about within the DSM, and it's still not. We were talking about how it's still not very helpful or supportive in diagnosing people with PTSD. It has a very strict criteria, which irrationally strict.
Yeah, because it has to have. I wrote down some of these things, and it's still like. It's too specific. It's like intrusive.
I could get my DSM. Yeah. It's right here somewhere.
It's like a intrusive symptoms, avoidance symptoms, a negative mood, and hyperarousal that all have to be present for at least a month and cause significant impairments in like social situations or like occupational situations. And you have to have directly experienced whatever the event was. So you couldn't watch it on TV.
They removed that. They put that criteria in, right? I remember.
Yeah, they changed that because 9/11, people were coming in and saying, "Oh, I'm traumatized because I watched this on TV," and they're like, "No, you could not possibly have that."
So what was our stance on it when we learned about that? Are they traumatized, or do they think like? I feel like if someone's coming in and they're experiencing some sort of secondary or vicarious trauma, watching the Twin Towers fall, that is traumatizing.
Yeah, I mean. Yeah, you'd have to, if you looked at it through like a secondary vicarious trauma lens, you'd have to say that it is traumatizing.
But surprise, surprise, the DSM doesn't account for vicarious or secondary trauma. So
I really like that. Like if you have these symptoms, they also won't diagnose you with PTSD. If it hasn't been a month, they'll just say it's an acute stress disorder.
Right. Which is so important because the whole point of healing and processing trauma is to respond to the PTSD symptoms as if they are PTSD and have the person have a chance to process it as soon as possible. If you're waiting a month before you get the diagnosis, that's very harmful.
Absolutely. Because the thing that keeps you from having it turn into a traumatization is having like resiliency factors
Yep.
and getting in there and having your community support you right away.
100%.
Otherwise, you risk it being stored in your body.
Imagine like you go through the most horrific trauma ever involving the most insane or like disgusting types of abuse, and you go into a therapist's office the week after and they go like, oh, I can't give you PTSD, it hasn't been a month yet. That's wild to me.
Yeah.
So I mean, yeah, sure, like you have a time period to let the body process the trauma, but if the presenting symptoms are there, treat it as it's PTSD, you know?
Absolutely.
Be trauma informed.
Absolutely. Yeah. When I was thinking about a traumatic event and like how we would define that.
I see Chad's trying to get your attention. She's like, I want to talk about trauma.
Come here.
My cats are in the background for those of you who are just listening.
I was reading something from Dr. Perry, and he was talking about the three.
Wait, before you go in, who's Dr. Perry? For the viewers?
He's an author.
He's a psychiatrist.
He's a psychiatrist
some
who
random
writes
author
books
about trauma.
No, he's like leading a lot of trauma research actually, and he's been studying trauma for the past like 30 years. So he was kind of like a pioneer in some of this trauma informed care, because surprisingly, it's only been around, or it's only really like
popped off.
Yeah, since like the 90s.
I feel like, and the one thing that made it more popular recently is The Body Keeps the Score. Just that book blowing up out of nowhere, and everyone cares about trauma now, but whatever.
Yeah, that's true. I see that.
I just made the connection. I was reading the book, the first few chapters a few weeks ago, and Vander Kolk shouts out Dr. Perry in the first few chapters. It's like one of my colleagues, Dr. Perry. Vander Kolk is another leading psychiatrist, researcher in the field of trauma. Anyways, sorry, go ahead.
Dr. Perry talked about 3 E's when it comes to trauma, and they were event, experience, and effects. So you have to like take into consideration those things whenever you're defining whether this event was trauma or it wasn't. And it also has to be personalized. Like I can't tell you that something was traumatizing for you, because I can't like put words into your mouth. Yeah. You know,
and you have no way of knowing my resiliency factors. Like you have no way of like understanding how equipped I was in processing that trauma due to my environment, or how poorly I was equipped.
Right. Exactly.
It's a spectrum.
And I think that's also difficult in clinical work too, where the client has to come up with what's traumatizing to them. You know, we as the clinicians can't say like, you're traumatized.
Yeah, right.
You know,
exactly.
yeah, sure, I think that. But
and it gets so much more complicated. I mean, I'm jumping ahead a few lectures that we're watching. By the way, some background information. We're making this because we're rewatching some of our trauma lectures, and we're coming together and talking about it. We were in the same program. Excuse me. So it gets even more complicated. I remember Dr. Vasquez, our professor, talking about how some people can get traumatized, whatever the event might be, and they won't have PTSD symptoms until like 2 years after or something for one reason or another.
Interesting.
You remember that?
No, I don't.
It's just people function in weird ways, like in different ways.
Yeah.
It could be that the trauma is stored up in a very specific circumstance, and it comes up in the right moment, the right time, a few months down the line, a year down the line. It's so weird.
That also, that makes me think of that example that I was talking about also from Dr. Perry about experiences making you or leading to traumatization or not. He like was talking about an elementary school, and like a first grader is in his classroom or her classroom, doesn't matter. And the classroom starts on fire. The kid is probably like scared for their life and like worried about what's happening. There's very real danger. Same exact event, but it's from the firefighter's perspective coming into the building. Like that's business as usual, right? They put fires out. It's not traumatizing to them. Fires are not scary to them because they do it all the time. Same exact event, but the 5th grader down the hall, if the same event can affect people differently, and that's probably part of the 3 E's, where we have to like take into consideration the event, the experience, and the effects that it has on all 3 of those parties. Yeah.
So that, I mean, I don't, unless you're taking a different direction. If we're talking about the event, the experience, and the effects it has, why don't you tell us more about what are some very, I guess, common symptoms that people might see after a traumatic event? Like, what would that 5th grader might notice within the first few months after the event.
That's funny because that's exactly where I was going to
sick.
go.
Okay, cool. I didn't write that. I'm not looking at that, but
But I was
it's
just
cool.
thinking
I'm a
of
psychic.
that, like thinking of like what the symptoms you would actually need to be aware of whenever you're dealing with, am I traumatized today? Is it something I need to address or not?
Yeah.
One thing that comes to mind for me is avoidance. You're taking extra caution to avoid being triggered.
Yep.
Like, I'm not going to go into this certain building because it reminds me of this event that happened. Or
and isn't it so wild how some people know that they're doing it, but a lot of the times people don't know they're doing that. They have their subconscious mind is kicking in, and they have no idea that they're avoiding whatever circumstance. And it goes back to the Chowchilla kids, how one of them had responses of like gaining a lot of weight because they wanted to, their lizard brain decided that they're going to like feel heavier so a kidnapper can't get them. And we'll break this example down later for you guys so you understand. But anyways, the body will respond in ways where it'll fly under your executive functioning, fly under your radar, and make decisions for you so you avoid the traumatic experience, even if you don't know what's happening. It's so wild.
That's also what is difficult about clinical work too, is that your clients are not aware of that. You know, they're not aware that they're avoiding those things because they might be traumatized. They're like, oh yeah, no, I just don't go by that building.
To it.
I just don't go into work, or I just am late for work every day. You know, stuff like that.
And I don't want to like diverge too much, but that just like for a quick second, I want to acknowledge that just leads us into all the gazillion different clinical conditions that are presented in the DSM that could just be manifestations of trauma. You have avoidant personality disorder now. You have BP, all the cluster B personalities, which are highly correlated with trauma. We can't clinically or in a research setting say that trauma causes it, but they're correlated highly. And trauma is just really good at masquerading as different diagnoses: ADHD, BPD, ODD, so on and so forth. So
yeah, I think that talking a little bit more about ADHD and how trauma can present as that is worth diving into.
Yeah,
because that's also one of the things. It has to be hyperarousal, which I mean can present with surprisingly hallucinations, and people will quickly write that off as schizophrenia. But
do you want to break down what hallucination is in the context for PTSD for our listeners?
Yeah, it could be like flashbacks, you know, stuff like that.
Absolutely.
It's like intrusive memories of what happened that you don't want, but they're kind of like popping in whenever you don't have control over that. People, or even nightmares too.
People who are victims and survivors of the most intrusive types of traumas are the ones most likely to develop hallucinatory. Is that a word? Hallucinatory?
It is for now.
Hallucinatory symptoms somewhere down the line, especially if the trauma goes unhealed. That might be hearing the event, being hypervigilant to the point you're hearing footsteps, being hyper paranoid. And that's how, like you were saying, it can look like schizophrenia.
Yep. Or I was going to say ADHD too. You know, whenever you hone in, you're always on high alert because you know that if I hear this certain footstep, then that's going to be harm to me. So you're constantly looking around, and that can look like hyperactivity if you aren't aware of the situation that the person is in.
So do you want to explain to us what exactly is the difference between ADHD and PTSD? Can you put that into?
Well, there's a lot of overlap.
It is. So like, what differentiates them besides the overlap? Like, what would you say?
The first thing that comes to mind is flashbacks, because I don't think you have very many flashbacks with ADHD.
Right. But I'm talking about more so the root cause. Do you know? Or do you want me to?
You go ahead.
Okay. So in a clinical setting, ADHD is recognized as a neurological disorder, or would you call it neurological? Yeah, right.
It's like neurodivergence. Yeah. So I suppose.
Basically, the theory is, again, I could get this completely wrong, but your prefrontal cortex develops in a different way where you are deficient in the proper enzymes and, I guess, chemicals in your brain that allow you to be in control of your executive function system. So that means it might come across as you have an inability to sit still and you're very hyperactive, or you have an inability to stay attentive for a long period of time. Therefore, you become inattentive. There's low impulse control,
Yep.
so on and so forth. Whereas PTSD, you have like a hyper arousal emotionally when you have a triggered response, a fight or flight response, or maybe you're hyper vigilant. So hypervigilance can look like a hyperactive in ADHD, or dissociation PTSD can look like inattentiveness in ADHD, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And high emotional hyperactivity or hyperarousal in PTSD can look like impulsivity in ADHD. And that's why there's such a strong overlap. We'll go into complex trauma another time, but complex trauma is like the king of mirroring ADHD like symptoms, along with a myriad of other diagnoses.
Yeah. See, PTSD is something that we need to save for another podcast for sure. So today we're just talking mostly about, you have an experience, and does that experience turn into traumatization?
Yeah.
Or are you able to work through it and it's not?
Yeah.
But you're right. With the ADHD and PTSD, they do have a lot of overlaps, because whenever you are traumatized, an event happens and then that gets stored in your body and you're traumatized. You're constantly like in fight or flight. Maybe not full blown fight or flight, but you're resting right
on
there
the edge,
so that you can switch on immediately.
Do you want to break down for the viewers, what does it mean for trauma to get stuck in the body? Because I don't know if the average person knows what that means.
Yeah. An example that I think of is like whenever we were looking at like war veterans or something like that, like shell shock. That was after World War I, I think it was, whenever they were doing like trenches or something, that trench warfare.
Yeah.
Yeah, they would the soldiers would come home and their bodies, like the way that they walked was just like, it looked painful to see. So it's just a really good example of how that trauma from war was literally stored in their body.
Yeah.
Their body was adapting to the trauma that they were experiencing. And that same thing can be applied to even lesser events than a war, a lot of times, I guess this would probably get more into CPTSD, but like a lot of times you'll see people closing in, because a lot of it is
due to
stored.
Like a threatening environment.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. It's like stored in your core,
Yeah, basically, when your amygdala fires off and tells your body to go into fight or flight or freeze if you develop that type of response. Your hippocampus is responsible for pairing the emotion to the physiological response or the event, right? So your brain is starting to take charge of taking notes of the event, not in a narrative way, but in more of a flashes of imagery type of way. Like, what are you hearing? What are you seeing? And so if you are in a place where you aren't able to fight or run your way out of the trauma, it essentially gets your brain stuck in that fight or flight mode. The moment you get triggered, your brain, that's the flashback / hallucinations you were talking about, your brain gets pulled back in time into the trauma event, and it is literally reliving the actual moment that it was happening, and that's why it's stuck in the body. It's resorting back to its initial primal response to the trauma event. And because the individual wasn't able to escape the trauma or fight their way out and process it in a healthy way, there is no resolution to this, at least not yet. Like the body is just stuck there.
Yeah.
So
that's a good, that is a good thing that Dr. Peter Levine, who founded Somatic Experiencing, also big in trauma,
bottom up approach,
talks about like how he found this approach whenever he was looking at animals, because they obviously get triggered too. Like they have a fight or flight. There's a predator coming at them. They have fight or flight.
More efficient than we are because they don't have a higher functioning brain. Like they don't have a prefrontal cortex like we do.
Yeah,
right?
that gets in the way.
Yeah, we get in our own way about making decisions. But go on, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Because then these animals will they'll do their response. They'll fight, flight, or whatever it is that they need to do at that time. They will do that. And then whenever the threat has gone away, oftentimes you'll see animals just like shake.
Yeah, shake it out or something. Like shake it off. And
because they're like ending this stress response cycle. And then boom, it's done. It's out
Yeah.
of the body. But because we're more advanced creatures, we are able to shut that off.
Is that really advanced, or are we just stupid?
I think it's stupid
I mean, no,
because
it's cool.
come on.
Yeah, obviously, like prefrontal cortex functioning is very important for the human experience. But the problem is we get in our own way, like we were saying.
Yeah.
Like you have the power to push your emotion to the side, and it builds up and it builds up until you get numb, and then you get numb in the body. But we'll save that for later.
Oh yeah,
So,
I was gonna say
yeah.
that was also something that I wanted to talk about is people who are traumatized
Yeah.
also have trouble like feeling their emotions
Yeah.
too. Because
Yeah.
we were watching something about war veterans coming back, and they were complaining about like, I just feel like a monster because I want to
Yeah.
love my son and I
remember that
should love
chapter.
my son, or like my grandpa died and I didn't
Feel a
feel
thing.
anything.
Right.
And I think
Dissociation.
yeah, that's something to touch on too, because before I started this, I certainly did not think that would be something that would be
Yeah.
considered
Yeah.
trauma.
So question, is that response of when you're becoming emotionally numb, is that something that's covered in the DSM?
Absolutely
Trick question.
not.
And why? And so tell me more about what you think is happening.
What I think, like my personal view on that is that it's a protective thing. You
Yeah.
know, if you start to feel those emotions, then it's harder. You're opening yourself up to vulnerability,
Yeah.
and vulnerability is seen as weakness.
Yeah.
And so your body kind of shuts that down.
Yeah.
Because if you feel it, then you kind of have to like address it,
Absolutely.
you know, or it can, if you're
Absolutely.
feeling those uncomfortable feelings, it gets in the way of if you need to get into fight or flight.
Absolutely.
Because if I'm feeling like down that my grandpa just died, it's probably harder for me to jump into fight or flight when I
100%.
need it.
Yeah.
But I don't know. That's just what I think.
I think you're right. And I think that what's the worst thing about it, your brain doesn't have a good understanding of how to filter out negative emotions from bad emotions. It's all emotions, right?
Yeah.
So if you filter out one negative emotion, it's going to filter out all the positive emotions too, and that's how people go numb, right? So if I'm preventing my brain from feeling anything so consistently, it just decides, all right, fine. If this part of your brain isn't necessary to you, then I'm going to just shut it off. It's wasting all this energy. But what happens is like veterans come home and they're emotionally unavailable for their spouses, for their kids, for their grandfather's funeral. Hi Lou. We got a little cameo from my cat. So yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. They just kind of like turn
down.
that part of your brain
Yeah.
off.
And we see it again. This is not just a war veteran thing. So that's the main thing that getting the APA and the field of mental health professionals to recognize for a while was that PTSD is not a diagnosis we just reserve for war veterans or prisoners of war. We see it in everyday life. People are doing that every single day. Whether
Yeah.
it's someone's being gaslit for their own experiences, they're not being validated. We're having a mass form of complex trauma right in front of our eyes.
Yeah, I think that it's a much bigger thing than what they thought originally too.
Yeah.
You know, like before it was just kind of like shell shock and reserved for people who went to war. But
Yeah.
now, as of recently, within the past 30 years, we're seeing that PTSD can come from a lot of other things
Yeah.
as well.
Yep.
But that's also a good kind of little segue to big T, little T traumas, which is just like it's just a clinical tool that we use.
Yeah. I want to see how many minutes we have left on the... Oh, we're good. 34 minutes.
It's just like a clinical tool that we use to kind of differentiate between experiences. Like little T traumas are things that might just be like little stressors that might not really affect anybody, you know, like they're stressful, but they might not turn into traumatization. They could if you leave them.
Yep.
Like,
What's an example of little T?
Like divorce or like emotional blackmail.
Yeah.
I can't pull. There's a lot of little T's.
Harmful home environment. You don't feel safe where you are. Maybe a stressful work environment.
Yeah.
A toxic, abusive boss,
Yeah.
parent, caregiver,
Yeah.
so on and so forth. Like little things that are happening that are actively putting you in maybe not necessarily a full-blown fight or flight response, but it's definitely like increasing the amount of cortisol in your system.
Yeah.
What is cortisol? So the viewers know.
Cortisol is like stress.
Yeah, stress.
It's like a hormone in your body that I don't know. It's kind of like adrenaline, but not quite. You don't feel it as much, and it's super harmful. But
well, it serves its benefit, but overproduction of it, there's an adverse effect.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Big T traumas are like the things that we think of every day of what we would think of as trauma, like first war, rape, murder.
Absolutely.
They have environmental disasters as a big T trauma too, which is much different than all of the other kind of traumas that we're talking about right now.
The social. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because there's a huge difference between like like a natural disaster, right?
Yeah.
There's nobody to blame for that. Like who do you blame? Like
right. And there's solidarity in if you and your community were all affected and you guys all rebuild together, there is a resiliency factor in coming together and processing and rebuilding. Yeah, because that is the biggest factor in whether or not an event is traumatizing is the community that you have. Yeah. You know, if you have to suffer in isolation, you're way more likely to be traumatized than if you're part of a community. Absolutely. That's why domestic violence can get so traumatizing, because you're suffering in silence. It's a power imbalance, and the abuser has the upper hand by controlling many different aspects of your life. Absolutely. But yeah, like this is what we were referring to earlier when we're talking about how if trauma develops or a traumatic event develops a PTSD, social support is a huge factor that goes into that, because more often than not, you're much more likely to become traumatized when another person is involved rather than an actual natural disaster. Now, don't get us wrong, you can absolutely get PTSD from a natural disaster. Oh, for sure. Absolutely. But the problem is like, the main thing that we see in common is like you go through the most traumatic event ever, right? Mm-hmm. Say that someone ties you down and pulls a gun to your head, robs you or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. And you didn't get a chance to, or maybe you did get a chance to run your way out of it, and you were able to escape. You go back home to your community. If your community allows to offer that safe space for you and is welcoming, nourishing, allows you to be how you are, maybe you need to kick, scream, be what your body wants you to do, there isn't the most guaranteed chance, but there is a good chance you might walk out of it without PTSD. Mm-hmm. Now, say that the same circumstance happens, but you go home to a community that tells you, oh, why were you there in the first place? That was your fault. Yeah. The body starts blaming itself for what happened, and you don't give yourself a chance to process the trauma. You don't give your body the chance to do what it needs to do. Mm-hmm. And that's how your chances of developing PTSD are, they just skyrocket. Yeah. The rates of it. That's also a really good point of like what kind of things and like behaviors and patterns we can see in people who have been traumatized. Yeah. But that's also a little bit of CPTSD where it's like kind of that blaming yourself. Yeah. And do we want to just give a brief sentence of what complex trauma is so we don't keep teasing people? We're going to talk about CPTSD later. We're not talking about it today. Yeah, definitely not today, but just so they know what we're referencing to. It's kind of like this one that we're talking about today is like one event, but CPTSD is like multiple events. It's just a constant, you're always in this environment. Fight or flight. Yeah. Exposure to a series of like harmful environments or a harmful environment that's consistent. Yeah. And the time of your life that some of those things happen really plays a huge difference. Like if it's within the first 2 months of your life, it has more profound of an effect on that person and their personality than if a person was fine for the first 2 months and then had adversity for the next 12 years. Yeah, I would even argue the first 3 years is like that whole window, right? Because that's when your brain isn't forming any memories. Your traumatic response is to immediately absorb it into the body, because you can't fight or run as a toddler, you know? Yeah, and I don't want it to seem like, this is all doom and gloom. Yeah, like all of this,
all these things that you form, you're probably going to form some behaviors. Like you are going to adapt to your environment in a way that keeps you the safest.
Absolutely.
Do those things help you in your current state right now? I don't know.
Yeah.
Usually that's whenever we see people coming in who are like, oh, I'm highly anxious. It's like, well, yeah, because that kept you safe.
Right. 100%. And I think and it's important to know, I put this out in my last video about how we compartmentalize umbrella symptoms such as depression and anxiety in isolation as if it's something wrong with your brain. I think that narrative is harmful and it kind of stigmatizes people struggling with mental health issues.
Yeah.
I think, I'm sure you agree. Let me know if you don't. But symptoms like depression and anxiety are a very good indicator from your body telling you that something's not okay.
Oh, absolutely.
You have gone through something, or maybe slowly have gone through something in the form of complex PTSD, or maybe a traumatic response, or maybe something in your environment isn't sitting well with you, that your body is forcing you to pay attention to it in the form of anxiety, aka you're dreading something, you want to run, you want to fight, whatever, or depression, loss of fulfillment, feelings of fulfillment and happiness and purpose in your life. Something in your environment is telling your body that it doesn't, and something in your environment is making your body tell you that you don't feel good.
Yeah, I agree. And what was on my mind while you were saying that was that, like, all behavior is communication.
Yes,
so a lot of the things
play therapy professor.
Right.
Yeah.
But we have it in the form of play therapy, and like kids communicate through their behaviors. But also I want to take it a step further and say that, like, if you have been through these CPTSD, sorry, if you have that throughout your child,
our viewers like, I hate you.
I know. If you have that,
this is kind of like when we were towards the end of our first semester, and our professor kept on telling
wait till
us,
spring.
"Wait till spring for me to tell you how to fix this," because he would tell us on all these like horrible symptoms of PTSD, and a lot of us related to these symptoms, and we just wanted to learn how to fix it.
How do we
like,
fix ourselves?
And he would like tell us all, and he'd tell us all about it, and be like, "We'll wait till the spring." And every class would end.
Summer.
And you want to learn how to fix it? We'll wait till the spring.
Yeah, I know.
I love the class. It was so great, but it was really funny.
Anyways, I digress. But I want to take it a step further in saying that all behavior is communication in the form of, like, the things that you did or the things that you're doing now. Maybe they probably don't serve you. They're probably maladaptive, meaning that, like, they're kind of harming you a little bit, but that behavior is a communication for a need that you had whenever you were a child.
Absolutely.
You know, so
and sometimes you develop adaptive behaviors as an adult too. It's still a form of communication.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I remember our professor would say, all behavior is a form of communication, and she also talked about how when people lie, it's because they didn't feel safe enough to tell the truth. Yeah. So cool. Anyways.
Yeah. I loved that one. And I also, like, I guess that translates to inner voice too. I always loved that too. Like, where did these things start?
Absolutely. You know, I just made my newest video about that too, about your inner voice. Like, when you are talking to yourself, especially through times of adversity, when you're like, say you dropped something and you're like, "Oh, you idiot," or whatever. Who's really saying that? Like, the human body doesn't naturally learn to hate itself in times of mistake. Somebody said that to you somewhere along the way, and you've adopted it as your own. Yeah. It's wild.
It's interesting, the things that are maybe not working for you now today, or that are problematic, they probably kept you safe at some point.
Absolutely.
And just trying to rabbit trail that to the source. Ooh, it's tough because it rips apart your identity, but it's also really healing and worth it.
Absolutely. And also, disclaimer, we're not telling you to go ahead and rip apart your identity.
Please don't.
This is so, especially if you're painful, dealing with a lot of trauma, it is so crucial and essential that you do it in a safe environment with a trained professional or with someone you feel very supportive and safe around. Because, I mean, you might hear them be like, "Oh, whatever, like I want to just heal from this stuff." The problem is you are at risk of re-traumatizing yourself.
Absolutely.
If you jump to forcing yourself or strong-willing yourself through healing trauma, you are most likely going to just re-traumatize yourself and make the trauma worse.
You're dealing with systems that your body has put in place for however many years.
Yep. It's like picking a scab and constantly making it bleed and not allowing it to heal.
Yeah. It's just not going to work for you.
Absolutely.
Anyways, back to traumatic events. We talked a little bit about big T, little t. Oh, we could talk about the dose response.
Oh, yes.
That's pretty fun. So like the higher the severity, the higher the symptoms.
Yep.
So
what does that mean for our viewers?
The more severe the event, the worse your symptoms are going to be.
Yes.
Or maybe even that you would have more symptoms in that category of PTSD.
And everyone's so unique. Everyone has such all of this stuff, your response in regards to how many symptoms you come up with or how severe the symptoms are is all a spectrum.
Absolutely.
And it's all unique to your own experience.
And that's why the DSM sucks. Yeah. Sorry, but
well, the DSM is systemically not incorrect, but I would say culturally insensitive.
Absolutely.
Because all of its data is using the experiences of the Western privileged persons as a default model.
Yep.
And so the example would be ADHD does not look the same in a boy who grew up in Pakistan and their entire life versus ADHD in a white person in America, or even a Pakistani person in America too.
Right.
It'll come up differently culturally.
Absolutely. And we need as clinicians to be aware of that.
Yeah.
But they don't put that in there.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, for our DSM heads out there, yes, there are diagnoses now that include the criteria that the presenting symptom cannot be a part of a cultural expression. But I don't think we need to stop there. I think that's not enough for the APA to recognize the importance of differences within symptomology in different cultures.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyways, we diverge a little bit.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Something else that I was going to say about kind of dose response is that the more traumatic events that you go through, maybe they're not traumatizing you, because there is a difference between a traumatic event and traumatization.
Yes.
The more you kind of go through those, say I'm already traumatized. I grew up in a family that was really rough, or I had some verbal abuse or something like that. And then I have this other experience, maybe I have a negative sexual experience or something like that. And I'm just kind of adding to my cup. So then you kind of, what I use with my clients is you imagine this cup full of water and it's just all the way full to the brim. It's just doming, it's the fullest cup you have.
Yeah.
That's a cup full of your experiences that you've had. So then any type of little stressor that you add is just that little drop of water that will just send you over the edge. So any little stressor at that point could become traumatizing.
And that response is more emphasized the closer you feel it to the actual traumatic event. For example, if you go through a negative sexual experience and your body gets into hypervigilancy mode where it remembers the face of the perpetrator, so on and so forth. If you're around people who kind of look like the perpetrator, that will kind of join it within your abstract mind, join this blob of your trauma response. It'll all become one bigger thing the longer you wait from dealing with it and processing it. Because all PTSD healing, I mean, not to simplify it down, but PTSD healing involves the act of disassociating the association of your traumatic response with the external stimuli. For example, say that your trauma response was a car accident and it was a red car, and whenever you see a red car you get triggered and you go into fight or flight. The idea of healing this trauma would be to allow your lizard brain to understand that it didn't die, that the red car isn't going to kill it today, that bring it back to the present, and detaching the red car from the fight or flight response. Yeah. Recalibrating it.
That's a fun concept too, because that's in trauma therapy and stuff. It's you can't use CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, because you're basically just being you're safe now. You're safe now.
Yes.
Don't worry about the red cars. They're fine. Right. They're safe. But that's you're talking to that higher functioning part of your brain. But the lower part of your brain is just programmed to think red cars are bad. They're dangerous.
This is why when you're watching, or maybe I shouldn't use that example, but this is basically why when you're elevated and you're triggered, telling someone to calm down won't work. Exactly why you said that.
Right. And that's why people use maladaptive behaviors to calm themselves down.
We should tell the viewers what CBT is if they don't know. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a form of therapy that works with your rationale and your beliefs and how they impact your behavior and how your behavior impacts your rationale and your beliefs and so on and so forth. So it's working on a very higher brain part of your like system or higher system part of your brain where you're basically just doing talk therapy to like get yourself out of habits, and it can work for very surface level symptoms. But when you're talking about trauma, something that's deeply rooted in your lizard brain, you cannot CBT your way out of a fight or flight response.
No.
This is why we were saying I can't tell you to calm down when you're feeling triggered.
CBT works on higher level functioning brains.
Yes.
Right? And trauma is stored in that lower, in the body, and it's like in that lower part of your brain that you can't necessarily talk your way out of.
Yeah.
That's why you need a lot of different interventions with trauma therapy.
What are some interventions that are useful for trauma?
Oh, I mean, the basic one would be like mindfulness.
Yeah, sure.
Staying in your body and noticing what you're feeling, which can be hard if people can't feel their body.
I think this is why like everyone complains like, oh, meditating, blah, blah, blah. Like it doesn't work. It doesn't work because it's hard to stay in your body. Probably.
Yeah. It is hard to stay in your body. And if you have some of those like pretty aggressive symptoms, even if, it's tough.
What are some other alternatives, interventions that might help traumatic symptoms?
There's yoga has some really good research to back that it helps with GABA production, which helps to slow your brain down. And if you're traumatized, your brain is going because you're trying to stay close to that fight or flight. So if your brain can produce a little bit of GABA, it'll start to slow it down a little bit. And bonus, you get to stay in your body while you're doing yoga.
And from what we've learned, you can hate the yoga session as much as you want. It'll still give you the positive benefits you need when you come out of it. Like you'll come out of it and the GABA response, I guess the chemicals, I'm not too familiar with them. They'll do the work that they need to do. Yeah. So basically like body movement therapy and
body movement is really good.
Anything that lowers the heart rate, right?
Yeah.
Heart rate is huge for trauma healing.
If you're like noticing that your heart rate, you're sitting there and your resting heart rate is like 90 beats per minute.
There's a good chance you have a little bit too much cortisol in your system, and you want to take it down a little bit.
You might be carrying some stuff with you.
Yeah, and also this is going to be probably for another session because we didn't learn this until later in our lectures. But how quickly your heart rate spikes to like 90, 100 from like literally goes from 0 to 100 is also a good determination of like how much trauma you're really dealing with, because your body is a little bit too quick to jump into that fight or flight response.
Yeah, that one's for another time. We'll go into heart rates and stuff a little bit.
She's the one who's moderating our time, and I'm the one who's like, what about this? What about that?
There's just so much fun stuff to talk about with trauma, but you first have to know what a traumatic event is and like what it would look like in your life before you could like even start 100%. To get into some of this other stuff.
Yeah. So what's next for our list?
We were talking a little bit about like the difference between traumas. We talked about the natural disaster.
Oh yeah. Oh
yeah.
My God.
And then we kind of, and then we kind of got off track, but we were going to talk a little bit about like, the difference between some of them, because like the more harmful traumatic experiences are usually ones that are relational. Like with a natural disaster, there's not one person that you can blame. You usually can be part of a community. Is it traumatizing? Sometimes. It's less likely to become traumatizing.
And I remember hearing this point that like, okay, well, if it's only sometimes traumatizing, why does my heart rate race when I hear of a storm coming in when I just survived a tornado last year or something? And that is a trauma response. But I would also, my professor brought this point up, and I'm inclined to agree. Like, I would also be okay with that response because your body is gearing up for something that could actually be harmful, like an actual natural disaster.
Yeah,
that's a normal response. The whole point of addressing PTSD is like an over response or hyper hyper extreme response to the stimuli, they shouldn't cause a response. Hence the red card triggering you.
Yeah, because there's a difference
Yeah.
between like normal stress, right? I'm
Yes.
supposed to get stressed
Absolutely.
with, I don't know, a lot of work to do at work.
But
Or
when a
I'm
big storm's coming, maybe like you need to be like
You
going to
do
fight or
need to
flight, just
be.
buckle down and make sure the house is
Yeah.
okay and you're
Yeah.
safe.
What if you need those
Yeah.
systems in your body to keep you safe? Like you should be stressed with some of this. But with trauma, when you're traumatized, you're starting to have these systems kind of go a little haywire. You know, they're not working how they should. And it's causing a lot of like damage to your body.
And it goes right back to when we were talking about anxiety. Like anxiety isn't bad in and of itself. Chronic anxiety can be debilitating. It's your body telling you that something's not okay.
Yeah.
But anxiety in healthier doses, when like you have a test coming up or
That's
a job
fine.
interview, like that's good. It makes your body gear up. And that's why I feel like we need to be better at addressing anxiety as an isolated response. And instead of numbing it down completely, we need to restore it back to normal levels.
Yeah, like being okay sitting with some uncomfortable feelings.
Yeah, 100%.
Because it does suck to sit with uncomfortable feelings. They don't feel super good. But if you numb those ones, then you're numbing
The good ones.
comfortable ones too.
Yep.
Like then it's tough. Then you get the people who are like, I want to love my son, but I'm holding him and I just don't feel it.
Yes,
you know? And
yes.
it's like, you're robbing yourself of that
Yeah.
because you can't feel the other stuff too.
Absolutely.
That's part of the human existence.
I mean, this is also a story video for another day, but this new movement of like men over identifying with masculine features, and part of that comes in the form of like, oh, men don't show their emotions. Men are weak if they cry in front of a woman, like all that BS. You're actively like shutting down parts of your brain that you need to survive. So, but whatever.
Yeah. So we have to be like really careful with that because it's big in trauma too.
Absolutely.
Is being able to feel your emotions where it's at in your body.
Yep.
And if you can't do that, then we got to move to sensations. And if you can't feel those, then we have a lot of work to do, which is fine. We can do that. It's just, it'll be a longer road. Yeah.
It's better for you down the line to address what's immediately in your area. Like in your, sorry, I got distracted by the cat. Address what's immediately on your mind, right? Your brain will always present to you and push towards you what it needs you to address ASAP.
Yeah, when it feels it's safe and comfortable.
And that's why we end up scrolling when we're safe and comfortable because we
got to avoid.
Yep.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
What's next?
Oh, we keep getting distracted from the person.
From the person?
Yeah, we keep talking about there's just like
there's
a
so
relation.
much. It's a whole like tree of like how everything branches out one topic to another.
I know.
It's so hard to talk about trauma and not talk about everything else the trauma is related to.
I know.
Which is also trauma.
Yeah, this one's kind of like a scatter of like all of what trauma is. But
so what were you getting at about the person?
That it's a relational component, you know, like in the same way that community and relationships prevent traumatization,
they can also
like really harm people if that's part. Like if you think about rape for example, like this is a person that's supposed to be trusted. Usually, sometimes we don't know who the person is, but this is a person that we think, people aren't bad people. They try to do good, but this person is inflicting a lot of pain on me and like, I'm not able to do anything right now. Yeah. Like having that relational aspect of the event it fundamentally changes your worldview because like you said, by the way, we're not saying that community is bad. You need community to heal from trauma. It is an absolute essential component to your trauma healing factors or your resiliency factors. But relationships that are toxic and abusive to you are what might make people seem dangerous to your lizard brain or your subconscious mind. When you're expecting some sort of loving and nurturing response from someone and they turn around and they harm you, it convinces your brain that you're not safe. People are generally suspicious, not to be trusted. It's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy because if you hurt me and I start believing people are untrustworthy, I start isolating myself, and because I'm isolating myself, I'm not seeing any more good people, and I'm actively like staying in the isolation, and
the idea of going out and seeing someone who is going to hurt me is scary enough that I'm going to go back into the isolation and go deeper and deeper,
Right.
instead of like experiencing life events that consistently contradict which would tell me, oh, people can actually be good. Right?
Yeah, that's a good point of like cognitions that we
Yes.
have about the world, you know, because events like this, like a singular traumatic event can change how you view the world.
Yeah.
A lot of times CPTSD will change how you you
Absolutely.
view the world. And it can be anything from like people are untrustworthy, or I'm unlovable,
Yeah.
or love is, you know, whatever it is. It
A
can,
lot of people have like cognitions about not seeing longevity in their life. They start talking in more ifs. If I make it to 30 instead of like when I make it to 30.
Yeah.
If I ever have a wife, if I ever have kids, rather than when
Right.
I'll have kids.
yeah.
Yeah, it's very weird.
Yeah.
Well, not
So
weird. It makes sense, but
it makes sense, and it changes your worldview. And I think because your worldview changes,
yeah,
you have behaviors that adapt to that.
absolutely.
So it's all kind of intertwined.
Yeah. We have about 8 more minutes
That's okay. Because
to the camera. So what would you, so with all that being said, what would you want the viewer today to walk away with?
Ooh, that's a good question. Probably just knowing that a traumatic event is different than traumatization,
Yep.
and what traumatization kind of looks like.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah. And I would also want to stress the importance of checking in with yourself and regulating. If you're finding that you're one of the people whose heart rates are constantly skyrocketing and you're always on edge, maybe a good sign to do some more chillaxing exercises. Maybe it's yoga, maybe it's going for walks, anything that helps your brain unplug from your dissociative behaviors, whether it be scrolling on your phone, and coming back to the now, but also only if that's accessible and safe to you. I recognize that could be dangerous for some people who aren't equipped with the right coping behaviors to deal with the presence of, trauma or whatever.
Yeah. Definitely start
Yeah.
with like nature walks.
Yeah.
Like that's a good
maybe
start.
with some company, like someone you trust.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
But I think I like to emphasize this as like a really big thing that I think contributes to trauma healing, especially like 3 major pillars to well-being, or your quality food, water, shelter.
Yep.
Unfortunately, we're the richest country in the world, but we have yet to come up with a more optimized way where everyone can access a quality form of food, water, shelter. So we're waiting on that as a society. Number 2, I think a sense of community, people that you feel safe around, people who have fulfillment in their own roles, and you guys can bounce off ideas. You just feel safe and comfortable around them.
Yep.
And number 3 is something bigger to look up to. And you can call this spirituality. I don't necessarily mean religion. Like, I understand religion can cause trauma. I more so mean something that is bigger than you, that you can come together as a community to believe in. All of these things tied together are a really unique way of not only putting you in your place of the universe in this world that we live in, but also finding that sense of belongingness within that universe.
Right. Yeah.
So.
I think that's kind of like the key to well-being.
Yeah. And if you look at the factors that it takes, and we'll talk about this in a later video, if you're looking at the factors that it takes to heal complex PTSD, those components are essential. Like, if you don't have a community, if you don't have food, water, shelter, if you don't have safety and predictability in your environment, it is nearly impossible for your body to feel safe enough to put itself back together.
Ooh, this brings up another fun CPTSD
Go
where
off.
you just you just adapt to chaos and unpredictability,
yes.
and that feels safe.
Yeah, and that's also another reason why it might look like ADHD, because you might be an adrenaline junkie. And you look like you're hyperactive, and really you use that to survive.
Yeah, because then whenever you're in a safe environment, your body, it kind of freaks out, and it's like, this is not right. This is not safe. I have to do something to make this environment unsafe. And that's where you also get behavior is communication, because you're going to do something
100%.
that is going to make your environment feel chaotic and unpredictable.
Absolutely. Wild.
But that's for another day.
100%. So, long story short, all behavior is a form of communication. Take it seriously, whether it's your behavior or someone else's. A traumatic response is a response to external stimuli that might cause harm. If that trauma response is not processed after the harm is over, you are a good chance of developing PTSD. If you have good resiliency factors like a good environment, supportive people who allow you to process, PTSD might diminish in its chances of developing as PTSD, I guess, for lack of a better word.
Right.
What am I missing? What are you want to chime in?
I think that covers pretty much just our basics of trauma.
And trauma is a physiological response. It is not a mental illness. It's not something that's stuck in the brain.
Yep.
Trauma is the reason why it's stuck in the body is because trauma is a body response. Your body and your amygdala, your lizard brain and your body are both working together to respond to this stimuli.
Yep.
And which is why I get very frustrated when people say, "Oh, trauma's in your head. It's in the past."
Well,
no, it's not. It's in your body physically.
It's like a really, really old system in your body.
Absolutely. 250 million?
I don't know, but
old?
it works.
It's your lizard brain. It's your most primal brain that you have access to.
The most basic thing that you can have with the human body is this response.
Absolutely.
And it's in your head, but it's not in your head.
100%. All right. Well, I think that's everything from me.
Yep.
Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Do you have any last minute things to say, Becca?
Yeah, just wait till we get to CPTSD.
CPTSD. 100%. There's going to be a long one. But thank you guys so much for tuning in. You've been watching Traumadelic. I'm going to upload it to Traumadelic. Is that
Sounds good.
Cool. Again, Umar Chauhan, LMSW, licensed master of social worker.
Oh, I'm Becca, and I get to be LMSW too.
Absolutely. So we're therapists. We kind of know what we're talking about here.
Sorta.
We're trauma-informed therapists.
We're always working towards being better.
Absolutely. Hope you guys have a lovely day. Don't forget to wash your hands and take it easy. Peace.